Hello, minions. It's Wheezy. And I've been considering whether or not I even wanted to do this video. But then I got Assassin's Creed 3, and I was like, MERICA! And I was like, maybe with November 6th coming up, I should probably follow up on what I said in a previous video, which is maybe have a little bit of a, let's call it an ideological discussion to avoid some things. But yeah, I'm going to talk politics for a little bit, so please, if you're not interested, I understand, that's fine. There are a lot of people who just don't want to hear other people's opinions, and that's your right. Let me preface this by saying I'm not going to try and convince you or change your mind. I might present some information in this that will inform you as to why I'm making the decisions I'm making. But for my American viewers out there, part of being an American is making your own decisions, especially when it comes to public elections. And so I'll leave that up to you. But what I see a lot of, and what discourages me, is uninformed people. And not just uninformed people, but uninformed people who are very adamant that what they think that they know is the truth without doing any research. They see a 10-second political commercial, true on all sides of the aisle, and they think that's the truth because, even though that anyone would tell you that a politician's going to lie to them, when it's their politician talking to them, then he's telling the truth. So there's this interesting, and it's true not just in politics, but in sports and everything else where there's some sort of competition, mine versus his. You're always biased towards your side. I'm going to try to have a discussion that avoids some of those pitfalls, and let's keep an open mind and let's talk about things conceptually. And this is not going to be an endorsement as much as it is trying to be informative. And I'm not going to go through all the effort of adding annotations, links, and stuff in the description for the things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try and talk about them in a way that is Googleable. Okay? Let's use that word, Googleable. The things that I'm going to talk about that I think are interesting points should be easy enough for you to find using Google or just with your own research. And I think that should suffice. So let's get into it first of all, and really the key of this whole election coming up obviously is the presidency. I mean, we're talking about seats coming up in Congress as well, but really the buck kind of stops at the president, especially when it comes to passing legislation. The House and the Senate pass a piece of legislation. The president has the ability to veto it, and then it takes a overwhelming majority of Congress to overturn the president's decision. So that's a lot of what we've seen over the past 2/4 years. I say 2 years because 2 years ago is when the Republicans took over the House of Representatives, where before that it was complete governmental control by a majority of Democrats. So my point being that who we put in charge makes a bigger impact than even I really originally thought about. But let's talk about the most important thing. And for my non-American viewers out there, I'm sorry if this is not interesting and you click away and you're like, I want to watch Assassin's Creed, but I don't want to listen to you rabble on about American bullshit. And yes, I want to point it out, I do realize the irony in talking about America while the character that I'm playing in Assassin's Creed at the beginning is actually English. This is Hathan something or other, and he's an English assassin, which is who you start out as. I wanted to do an Assassin's Creed 3 video because it's about the American Revolutionary War, but I haven't gotten to the part in the campaign where you're actually playing as the Native American protagonist that you are through most of the game, battling in the American Revolution. And I wanted to do this video. I thought about postponing it, but I want to do it. So anyway, going back, I want to maybe before we do any of this, I would like you to go to a website for me and check something. And that website is called isidewith.com. And the reason I want you to check that out is maybe you don't know who you agree with on most things. I actually found it very interesting when I went there and checked things out, because I was pretty sure who I agreed with, and actually I ended up being mostly correct. But I was actually surprised by the result that I got. And I think you should check it out as a precursor to this. So pause this, go there, isidewith.com, all words. And I'm not getting money from this site or anything for those of you conspiracy theorists out there. It's just something I got linked through from actually Gary Johnson's website, where he's kind of just like, look, do you really know who you agree with? And so I was like, you know what? Let's find out. And basically what it does is it gives you a bunch of questions that ask you kind of key issues, and some of them you can kind of recognize and kind of pick your horse. But if you just go through and answer honestly how you feel about each topic, then at the end it tells you ideologically who you most associate with in the presidential campaign. And it doesn't just have the two main candidates. It doesn't just have Romney and Obama. It has all the independent candidates as well. So I think that'd be interesting for you to go check out and just to kind of get a primer on how you feel about things. Although for me it comes down mostly to a key issue right now, which is the economy, because that affects me and my family and really the entire country in a way that most people don't really anticipate. Because most people aren't aware of how big a crisis this country is headed for if things don't get shaped up. And I'm not entirely sure that either of the two main candidates can really have 100% impact, but I know that from what I've read and from what I've seen, and not from political campaigns, but from reading budgets and looking at as much information as I can from both sides, the decision that I came to independently indicates that one side has a much better idea of what it takes than the other. So go to that website and come back when you've kind of seen who you are. And I'll give you my results right now. I went there, and when I answered all the questions, I was surprised. I wasn't surprised in that the person I sided with most was Gary Johnson, who is the libertarian candidate for president, meaning he's not going to win, right? And I've talked about this before, but just as a reminder, libertarian, the kind of rule of thumb with libertarian is fiscally conservative, socially liberal, meaning libertarian, you believe in what the United States of America was founded on, which is individual freedoms, and the core concept of individual freedoms is not imposing your moral and religious views on other Americans, and having a government that helps provide a safe foundation and protection for the country, but that doesn't interfere in individuals' lives. And by being the United States of America, delegates a lot of the more, less nationally critical interest to the states, right? The idea of regional issues is that the federal government doesn't know what's best for the entire country. The states know what's best for the people in their state. So, like, what's good for people in Texas, what's good for people in Oklahoma, is going to be very different from what's good for people in Massachusetts and California and Florida. I mean, these places are all very different, and the people that live there are very different. And the idea that the federal government can make one rule that covers all of these places in a way that's good for everybody is ridiculous. So the idea of fiscally conservative comes down to not just reduce government spending, but also reduced government oversight of a lot of things. Not anarchy, not no government, but that the government doesn't concern itself with things that it shouldn't. And I'll start getting into individual policy applications and some of these things. But for me, it was Gary Johnson, number one, which didn't surprise me because that's how I kind of associate myself. And it was 82% for me for Gary Johnson. And I was actually kind of surprised that was a little lower than I expected. Gary Johnson actually has some views on the military that I don't completely agree with. He subscribes to more of the traditional 1920s, 1930s isolationist view of America, which I understand. I see the point of view of America not involving itself throughout the world, and that we just take care of our own business and let the world fall apart if it wants to on its own. It's not our responsibility, for instance, to create peace in the Middle East. It's not our responsibility to rectify differences between Israel and Palestine. It's not our responsibility to stop oppressive dictators in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's those countries' problems, and we should leave them to it. I don't personally agree with that. I think that there's a whole Spider-Man aspect of with great power comes great responsibility. Those with the ability to protect the weak have an obligation to do so. That's my belief. And that differs with Gary Johnson. So I think that accounts for a good amount of why I was 82%. But what did surprise me is that number 2 on my list was Romney at 81%. And I thought it would be a much bigger gap than that. I thought it would be probably on the order of 60, 70%, because the socially liberal side, which I am, and the fiscally conservative side, I thought the fiscally conservative would line up and the socially liberal wouldn't so much. But apparently my views are moderate enough, and Romney is moderate enough in his views. He's not a far right-wing conservative, that I actually matched up 1% below Gary Johnson with him. So I thought that was interesting. The similarity between my associations with Romney and Gary Johnson. 4th on my list, there was another independent candidate. Actually, let me check real quick. Virgil Goode of the Constitution Party was at 61%, and then Barack Obama at 59%, followed by the American voters at 58%. It actually keeps track of what most American voters agree with, and I agree with a majority of them, but not a vast majority. So, and that's how America works. But the idea of putting someone in control who believes that the federal government knows what's best for the country is like the idea of saying that California, by means of having the highest population and the most number of electoral votes, should have the ability to dictate how every state runs itself. I mean, that's an overgeneralized, boiled-down version of it. When it comes down to it, the impact that larger states have on electing the president is fine if they elect a president who doesn't believe that it's the federal government's job to decide what's good for the states. So when you have a majority for a candidate like a Barack Obama who believes in big government, who believes that, and I'm not saying these in a negative way, they're just different from my ideas, that the government's responsibility is to look after its people in every aspect of their life. It's their job to make sure that the people that you're working for are really kept under tight control. That it's their job to make sure that the amount of money you get is in line consistently with what the federal government says it should be. And that how your employer decides to give you benefits is in line with what they say. And one thing, I'll try and bring up individual things as I go because I'm going to forget to come back to them.
Evening, sir.
The whole idea of Obamacare and even the comparisons with Romney Care, they say it's the same basic model, which is true. There's no arguing that. Romney doesn't argue that. Obama actually says it as a defense of Obamacare. But the major difference that Romney's pointed out that most people seem to be ignoring is that Romney instituted that healthcare system for Massachusetts because it's what that state needed and what was best for that state. Obama wants to put it across the entire nation, regardless of individual need. And that's a problem. So I don't have a core problem with, other than the fact that it drives up federal spending to a point where you're going to bankrupt the nation. I don't have a fundamental problem with I hate to call it social health care. I don't like the idea of socialized things in the country. But, that's an issue. So, but along those same lines, they even brought it up in the debates, the idea that that employers should have some flexibility over what kind of benefits they can provide to their employees. And I'll give you a specific example because it's what they brought up in the debates. Birth control. Now, to a lot of people, like me, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want to provide birth control coverage to your employees, right? From my personal perspective, I don't have a problem with birth control. But there are companies, like there's a company in Oklahoma, which is where I grew up, called Hobby Lobby. And they're a family-owned business that is a Christian company. And they have built their business on Christian principles. And since it's a private business, right, not a publicly funded business, that's their right. But part of the traditional Christian belief, or at least Catholic belief, is that birth control is wrong, unnatural. The Catholic Church doesn't support the use of birth control. They support what's called it suddenly just jumped out of my head, but it's basically birth control through monitoring of menstrual cycles and basically using birth control by knowing that there are certain times of the month when a woman is most fertile, when you shouldn't have sex if you don't want to have children. So natural birth control, if you will, not artificial birth control. So if you're a Christian company who believes that, and you have employees who have been hired under the assumption that they're working for a Christian company, then they have some reasonable expectation that their benefits will be in line as such, that the company's not going to pay for them to have an abortion, that the company's not going to pay for their birth control, that the company isn't going to pay for them to start a atheist book club. I mean, you see where I'm going with this. I'm exaggerating a little bit to make a point. But the idea is that the federal government is infringing on the religious freedoms of a privately owned business, because they think that it's their job to do what's best for everybody. And there's the argument, which is not as good an argument in a down economy like we have now. Say, if you don't want to work for a company that doesn't pay for your birth control because they are a Christian company, don't work for that company. And in an economy like this, you can't say, well, I'm not going to quit my job to get birth control coverage. But that's the assumption you make. Like, if you go and you work for a fast food restaurant and you say, my religion says that I can't handle fast food, your expectation when you got hired for that job is that's what the working conditions you would be in. You can't get hired to work at McDonald's and say, but I won't flip burgers. I mean, again, I'm exaggerating, but you see the point. You can't make an unreasonable demand when you're hired under pretenses that you agreed to. So there's that whole side of it, and that again comes down to a states' right kind of issue. But let's get back to the economy here, because that's the key point I want to make, and I'm chewing up time because I'm a master of babbling and running my mouth. But there's one thing I want you to look at, which has been the biggest influence on me of who has the best economic policy. And I want you to put into YouTube Paul Ryan Path to Prosperity. And it's a series of videos that the House of Representatives Budget Committee, that was chaired by Paul Ryan, still is chaired by Paul Ryan, put out 2 years ago. Actually, that series of videos may have been a year and a half ago, but it's from a budget that they started producing 2 years ago, which gives a very clear example of how the tax plan and the overall economic plan that Mitt Romney supports now, as supported by Paul Ryan, how not only does it make sense and add up mathematically, even though all you hear from Obama's campaign is how Romney's not being specific about his economic plan, and the math just doesn't add up. The math doesn't add up. Well, it does, because it's the same budget that the House Budget Committee has been putting out for the last 2 years. Go read it. It's not an interesting read, but if you want to be informed, you gotta look at this kind of stuff. So you can check out just Google House Budget Committee. You'll find their website. Search for Senate Budget Committee as well, because that's the Democrat-owned House of Congress. And check out their budget, which, by the way, they haven't made an official budget. They've relied on the what do they call it? Basically this cost cap, this financial debt cap. Even though it's not a budget, they've been relying on that as their budget through 2013, which is basically a way of them not dealing with the situation in our country. But go check out the Path to Prosperity. Go check out the opposing side's plan. It's not much of one. In that the Democratic economic plan stretches out over the next 10 years and attempts to stop the increase in the deficit. Not necessarily reduce it, but stop its increase over the next 10 years. But then they have no plan for what to go as entitlement programs go out of control. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But the plan put forward by the Republican side, the House of Representatives Budget Committee over the last 2 years, and the one endorsed by Mitt Romney, helps reduce the deficit to a level that's not even, right? It's not no deficit. It's still a little bit of deficit. But the idea being that the accompanying tax reforms and resulting economic growth helps offset that and actually gets the deficit down and starts going on the positive direction and reducing the national debt. The Democrats simply don't have a plan that goes that far. For the next 10 years, they've got a rough plan that doesn't fix the problem but delays it. And beyond that, entitlement programs, which is not a derogatory term, it is an official governmental term for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. becomes unsustainable because the baby boomer generation, of which my mom is a part, are retiring. My mom's 62 years old. She's going to be retiring soon. Actually, shit, my mom is 63 years old. She's going to be retiring in the next 2 years. And baby boomers are retiring at a rate of 10,000 people a day. And if you think about the fact that with Medicare and Social Security, I believe I'm correct on this, the benefits you receive from it are greater than what you put into it. So if you put $10 into Social Security, you get $30 out. I mean, you'll have to look up the actual math to see how it works. But the idea being that the government keeps your money safe, invests it, and makes a return on it. Well, with such a these systems were set up in I forget, the 50s, the 60s. They just didn't have an idea of what the baby boomers were going to be doing to this system, and why it'll need a reform is because as 10,000 people a day retire and go onto these systems, the government can't afford to pay them at that same level because where does the government get money other than China? Is taxpayer revenue. So the only way to continue paying for increasing costs on entitlements is to raise taxes on your people. So old people are being paid for by young people still working and paying taxes. Now, there's no reason to cut these programs, and the Democratic plan doesn't change them at all. It helps offset some of their cost over the next 10 years, and then kind of it says the people that get elected 10 years down the road, they can deal with the problem, which is a bad idea. The Republicans deal with this plan by saying, for the next 10 years, people that are 55 and above who are going to be retiring in the next decade, the system is unchanged for them. They've presumably planned their retirement around the benefits they'll receive from Social Security and Medicare. So don't touch it for them. So my mom, no changes to her. But for me, it goes to a competitive system where they introduce a private option, right? They still have the traditional option, but they introduce a private competition into it, so that if the private options are cheaper to the customer, which they almost always are, because the government is inefficient in general, and I know this working for a private company that is majority a government contractor, that they're not as efficient as the private sector can be. So the idea that this voucher system, as it's called, which is roughly accurate, is a bad idea is just wrong. You're using the capitalist nature of our free market economy and letting competition drive the cost of services down so that the entire system is cheaper. The government doesn't have to subsidize you as much because the systems that you're taking advantage of, your medical care and retirement, are cheaper, and that drives the cost of the government, entitlements down, and it makes sense. Go look at both the plans, see which side you agree with. I think that's a key issue. Social issues, I will tell you the moderate side of the Republican Party, because in general the Democrats are the social side. If you believe in social freedom, and you believe in not enforcing your religion on other people, then that's typically the way to go. But the views shared by the Republican side aren't to ban outright these things you don't like. And the key issue is abortion, right? Like, that's one of a woman should have the right to do what she wants with her body, which I could go on for days about how that's hypocritical in many cases, because of the assisted suicide laws and the drug laws. If you say a woman can do anything to her body, including having an abortion, but she's not allowed to give herself drugs, and she's not allowed to, if she has cancer and is in pain, she's not allowed to have someone help her end her own life. These are all kind of issues that are hypocritical. But anyway, the Republican stance, or at least Mitt Romney's stance, not the entire Republican stance, is that it should be up to the states to decide if abortion, for instance, should be illegal, right? And I like that idea to an extent. I don't like it completely. I like the idea of it being up to the individual, because it's a personal freedom, and it is a moral decision that is based for most people on a religious basis, which should not be legislated. But the idea of doing a state-based thing is that really conservative states in the middle of the Bible Belt, like where I grew up in Oklahoma and all through there, they can decide to make that illegal. And then states that are more conservative, like California, can allow it. And then at least, best case is someone who is really in need of those services can go and get one, even if it requires them moving to another state. I mean, let's talk an extreme circumstance, right? But anyway, the idea with Republicans, if you're moderate on your social views, is states' rights, letting the states decide these social issues. Assassin's Creed 3. So if you're a little sketchy about electing Republicans because of social issues, their support of the LGBT community and gay marriage, which, by the way, if you look up Obama's history on gay marriage, he's made several quotes in the past about how he believed marriage is between a man and a woman. So he's not the gay crusader you think he is. So just to cut through some of the bullshit on that, go look it up. It's not hidden information. You won't see it on television, but it's not hidden information. Basically, if you're worried about what Republicans will do to individual liberties, know that there's not a whole lot they can do because they will have Democratic opposition when they try to legislate this stuff, and the Republican idea of letting the states decide for themselves moderates that. So maybe that'll be a concession if social issues are more important than financial issues to you. I think with the problems facing our country right now, and look at what's happened to Greece. Go do some research on Europe as a whole, but especially Greece, where outrageous government spending has created an entitlement society where people are dependent on the government to keep them solvent, to keep them eating and clothed and shelter. They rely on the government for those things, and that's not the system we want here, but that's where we're headed with the amount of government spending we're doing. And I'll go back to entitlements real quick. The Republican plan to not modify entitlements for the next 10 years is sustainable by the cuts that follow on. The Democratic side of not cutting entitlements and then not dealing with it later on means that in 10 years, when this stuff is still unsustainable and they've had 10 years that they haven't done anything about it, then everyone's taxes are going to have to go up and benefits are going to have to go down. This guy stole an apple, so I go and knock him out. So basically, by not dealing with the situation, they're going to be unintentionally causing the situation they don't want, which is cuts to entitlement programs that affect everyone, not just the young. But yeah, I mean, I'm drawing to an end on this video. I've been babbling and babbling. But there's two things I would make. One, go and research stuff independently. Look at both sides and decide for yourself which you agree with and vote accordingly. And two is there is an important aspect of disliking the two-party system in America. If you want to vote libertarian and vote for Gary Johnson, I would support that decision. I would be doing it myself, except I live in Colorado, which is a swing state. If you live in a swing state, I would suggest you vote for your candidate, Democrat or Republican, because they're going to win the presidency. Right? So vote for them, because that could push the decision for the nation. But if you, on the other hand, live in a non-swing state, like Oklahoma is always going to go Republican, right? So if I lived there, I would vote for Gary Johnson, because if the Libertarian candidate or any third-party candidate gets 5% or more of the vote, the popular vote from the presidential election, then they get extra funding for campaigning in the next election, and they get on automatic inclusion on all the ballots in all the states, and they're also more likely to get included in major debates like Ross Perot was back in the 90s. So if you believe in breaking the two-party system, which I do, and you don't, please, if you live in a swing state, vote for your candidate, because that's how the country's going to turn out. But if you don't live in a swing state, vote for a third-party candidate if that's who you agree with most, like Gary Johnson, and help third parties get included in the government picture and the election picture in the United States. I hope this wasn't too boring. I hope I didn't completely offend all you guys. And I love you. I will talk to you later. Bye.